Throughout WWE's long history, the number one prize has always been the world title. And that statement, depending on what brand you're on at any given moment, can apply to either the WWE title, the World Heavyweight title, or even the relatively short-lived Universal title. But what of secondary gold? The belt that's generally saved for those who are on the rise and want to signal that they've finally arrived as a star of the future. Well, it's one of those belts we're going to look at now, probably the most important one in WWE as it happens. So join us as we take a deep dive into the entire history of the Intercontinental title. It all started in 1979. That was the year when Vince McMahon Sr.'s Worldwide Wrestling Federation decided that, after spending the first decade or so of their existence cycling through various mid-card belts like the WWF United States Heavyweight Championship, the WWF International Heavyweight Championship, and the WWF Junior Heavyweight Champion, it would finally settle on one for the long haul. What would this belt be called? Well, it would be called the WWF Intercontinental Heavyweight Championship, with it gaining this name on account of the fact it represented the unification of two prior pieces of gold, one real and one fictional. Yes, back in the autumn of '79, then WWF North American Heavyweight Champion Pat Patterson challenged the mysterious WWF South American Heavyweight Champion during the finals of a special one-night tournament held in Rio de Janeiro, with him winning this to call himself the first ever Intercontinental Heavyweight Champion. Of course, as it's known by most wrestling fans now though, that tournament never actually happened and there never was a South American title. No, the whole thing had been made up to offer a kayfabe explanation as to why this new prize suddenly was appearing at shows. How did Vince McMahon Sr. get away with doing this without anyone knowing about it at the time? Well, because back then you didn't have things like the internet in order to tell you all about what was happening around the world at any given moment. What would happen now that the Intercontinental Heavyweight Championship had been established? Well, it would quickly find itself ending up around the waist of some of the most talented mid-card acts in the company, as after Patterson dropped it in April of 1980, it would spend the next 3 years going between Ken Patera, Pedro Morales, and Don Morocco. And that was only the start, because by the time Vince McMahon Jr. took over the promotion during the early 80s, it would be on the verge of reaching a whole new level of prestige. Why was this? Well, at that point, the WWF World title was going to spend the better part of the next decade being dominated by the likes of Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior. Very over acts as far as star power went, but not people who were ever going to be accused of being spectacular in-ring talents. Now, if you were a high work rate guy, then the belt for you inside of the WWF system was going to be the Intercontinental title. And that's what led to Tito Santana and Greg the Hammer Valentine winning it in 1984 and 1985 respectively, with them here beginning the process of turning it into the prize that would guarantee the best wrestling match on the show. That said, what they would do would be nothing compared to what came next, as it would be on February 8th of 1986 at a live event in Boston that the man who, to this day, might be the most commonly associated with the prize would win it. That's right, this was the night that the Macho Man Randy Savage fully arrived in Vince McMahon's promotion by taking the belt off of the Hammer. And for the next year then, he'd go on a superb run with it, almost always stealing the show on whatever card he was on. Really, such a good job did Savage do here, he'd take the Intercontinental title to a level that, on the house shows in which Hogan wasn't there, it could easily main event and draw in a great crowd in the process. And it's a reputation which would only grow stronger after WrestleMania 3, as this was the show, in front of what was at the time the biggest live attendance any wrestling show had ever seen by a country mile. The Macho Man and Ricky the Dragon Steamboat would put on an absolute clinic, which for many people completely stole the show right out from under the main event of Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. So it shouldn't be a surprise to learn then that many of the people who would lace up their own boots in years later cite this as the moment which inspired them to do so. And that created a situation where, once many of these performers did finally hit a WWF ring, it wasn't the world title they dreamed about winning. Rather, it was the Intercontinental title they wanted, as that was the one which had the reputation of being the prize which the real wrestlers held. Sure, the WWF title had all the prestige, and it was surrounded by the glitz and glamour which came with that, but the Intercontinental strap, well, that was different. If you won that belt, then it proved that you could hang with the best actual wrestlers. And as the 80s went on, it would continue to build on its growing importance in the pecking order, when once Ricky Steamboat had his all-too-short run following his victory over Randy Savage at WrestleMania 3, it would spend the rest of the decade being further elevated even higher up the card. Sure, the next two champions, the Honky Tonk Man and the Ultimate Warrior, wouldn't be exactly what you'd call heavy work rate guys. But in the case of the former, what he was able to do was to take the belt a level above, as over the course of the 453 days he held it, he'd take on all comers, with many of his challengers being main event level guys. That said, no matter who tried to relieve Wayne Ferris of his gold, he'd always be able to squeak out a sneaky win come the end of the night. That was until he met the Ultimate Warrior, of course, as it would be at SummerSlam in August of 1988 that Jim Hellwig finally ended the champ's reign during a 31-second squash. Obviously then, this was a big deal for the legacy of the IC strap, as by the late 80s, the Warrior was skyrocketing in popularity so much he was actually starting to approach the level of Hulk Hogan. So at that point, there began being questions about who the real top dog was and which belt was the most important as a result. And this would all lead to a situation where, after he briefly dropped the gold to Rick Rude and then won it back again, Jim Hellwig would head into WrestleMania 6 preparing to go one-on-one with the Hulkster in a first-time-ever winner-take-all title-for-title match. That's right, the big question at WrestleMania in April of 1990 was which champion was going to be standing tall come the end of the evening. And to the surprise of some, that winner would end up being the Intercontinental Champion, the Ultimate Warrior, with this briefly unifying both men's singles prizes in WWF at the time. Unfortunately though, in the weeks following WrestleMania 6, on-screen WWF President Jack Tunney would formally decide that no one man could keep up the duties of being both World and Intercontinental Champions at the same time. And so this was why Hellwig would be forced to vacate the latter with immediate effect here. Who won the belt during the subsequent tournament to find a new one? Well, that would be Mr. Perfect. And this would begin the process of turning the IC strap into the true work rate prize once again. As with the Golden Era now coming to a slow end, and the New Generation era not far off, the next few years would see the mid-card gold go to a whole new host of acts like the Texas Tornado, the Mountie, and of course, Bret Hitman Hart. Yes, if Randy Savage was the man most commonly associated with the mid-card title during the Golden Era, then Bret Hart was probably the guy who would most become closely associated with it for the decade after, as he was able to infuse it with a level of in-ring skill which was another level up yet again from what anyone else had been able to do before. But then when you're the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be, it's a lot easier to take things to new heights. Hell, it would be the Hitman who would be right there front and center when, in the summer of 1992, the Intercontinental title reached what may very well be its highest watermark to date when he defended it against British Bulldog at that year's SummerSlam. That's right, with this pay-per-view taking place in the UK, it was decided that a hometown hero was needed for the closer. And so that was why, while the Macho Man and the Ultimate Warrior were fighting over the WWF title in the semi-main, the Hitman and Davey Boy Smith would be the ones going on last for the benefit of the live crowd. Needless to say then, by the time this one was over, it would be the Manchester native holding the gold around his waist. Sadly, however, the British Bulldog would not get a lengthy run after that, as mere months later it would bounce over to Shawn Michaels when the Englishman was abruptly fired in the wake of the steroid scandal. But at least there was a silver lining to this, and that was that Shawn Michaels was now the champion, because if there was anyone who could challenge Bret Hart's claim of being the best person to hold that title during the early to mid-90s, it would be the Heartbreak Kid. Come on now, it would be Shawn who would give us yet another high point for the Intercontinental strap when, at WrestleMania 10, he and Razor Ramon forever changed the game with their iconic ladder match, another one of the best matches in WWE's history. That's right, if it wasn't already clear by then, after WrestleMania 10 it was obvious for all to see that the best wrestling in WWF happened in the Intercontinental title division. And as the 90s progressed further, other high-level wrestlers would try to add to that growing legacy of the mid-card gold by having their own runs with it. We're talking about names like Marty Jannetty, Diesel, Jeff Jarrett, and Scott Hall himself. Sure, not every champion here would be a hit, as was the case with Dean Douglas, Mark Merrow, or Ahmed Johnson, but for every one of them there was a Gold Dust, a Hunter Hearst Helmsley, or an Owen Hart. And then of course, there were two men who would soon go on to become the biggest stars in the entire industry, Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock. Yes, while it's easy to look back on the feud between the Rattlesnake and the People's Champion as being a mostly main event one which centered around the world title, it actually began in 1997 when each wanted possession of the Intercontinental belt. Hell, so much would Austin covet the IC strap here, he'd quite literally fight his way through a broken neck at SummerSlam 1997 in order to win it. And this led to some great moments throughout the remainder of that year as he continued his rise up the card. Come 1998, however, Stone Cold would very much be the guy on top with the WWF title around his waist. And so it was then that the major Intercontinental title feud of that year would be The Rock doing everything he could to fend off the challenge of Triple H. How would this go? Well, it would mark another high point for the belt, as it would be at SummerSlam 1998 that, once again, the Intercontinental belt arguably stole the show during the ladder match between the Great One and the Game. But after Triple H had to quickly vacate the belt he won on the night as a result of an injury, it would also mark the beginning of the downfall in many ways. Why was that? Well, as the Attitude Era entered full swing, title changes started happening a lot more rapidly, and what this meant for the mid-card prize was that it would end up bouncing around a lot more amongst people who probably wouldn't have gotten a look with it during times prior. Sure, part of this was because the Attitude Era was a much less work rate focused era, with it instead relying more on the appeal of crazy storylines and Crash TV. But even if you take that into account, the likes of Road Dogg, Val Venus, and The Godfather calling themselves Intercontinental Champion during this period created a sense that the best days might be behind the once mighty prize. Sure, there would still be some solid performers who got a hold of it, performers like Ken Shamrock, Edge, and D'Lo Brown, but come late 1999, it felt like things might be on the verge of hitting a new low they were not going to be able to recover from. And then something happened to give some new life to the IC strap. In October of that year, for the first and to date only time ever, a woman won a men's singles belt in WWF. Of course, this was no normal woman though, rather it was the ninth wonder of the world in China. And with her making history here, it managed to give a second win to the struggling piece of gold, as from there, it had a bit of a resurgence during 2000 and 2001 when it was won by some of the best wrestlers on the planet again. We're talking about names like Chris Jericho, Kurt Angle, and Eddie Guerrero here. Again though, it wasn't like everything was perfect during the second half of the Attitude Era. No, there would be some less successful champs in there too, such as Billy Gunn and an otherwise very over Rikishi. But there was a general feeling that a corner had been turned. But alas, this second wind was not meant to last forever, as by the time 2002 arrived and the brand split was about to begin, it wasn't uncommon to see this once mighty piece of hardware bounce around in relevancy once more. So bad did things get here after a while, in fact. It would be in October of 2002 that once the belt had become a Raw exclusive following the first draft, WWE would make the decision to unify it with the European, Hardcore, and World titles, meaning that for a while, the last official champion was Triple H. Thankfully though, after realizing the error of his ways, Vince McMahon ultimately chose to bring the belt back less than a year later, with it being in May of 2003 that an all-new champ was crowned in the form of Christian. That said, even if this was good news for fans of the Intercontinental title, those good vibes would not last for long because despite there still being some high-level talent who held the belt in the years following, its booking would often be so lackluster it became hard to care about it at all. Sure, there were some highlights for the belt here. Highlights such as Randy Orton's excellent runs with it in late 2003 and early 2004, the same run which gave us his excellent street fight against Mick Foley at the latter year's Backlash. But really, even if the talent pool in the division remained high, the overall presentation of the belt just brought it down to such a low level. And that was how names like Shelton Benjamin, Johnny Nitro, Carlito, and even Ric Flair, people who would have made for great IC champs in decades prior, ended up flopping during their runs for the most part. Really, outside of that aforementioned Randy Orton run, one of the only times when the mid-card strap got any kind of real story during the 2010s was when Santino Marella won it, and from there went on a journey to try and beat Honky Tonk Man's then record single reign of 453 days. But even that angle was snuffed out way before it should have been, as Vince McMahon presumably got bored of the whole thing. Where would this leave things as the decade came to an end? Well, while there were continued attempts to raise the stock of the prize once more via names like CM Punk, JBL, and Rey Mysterio, they'd all eventually meet the same fate as Santino, as they'd never be able to get anything to work with for long enough to build the required momentum. What the Intercontinental title needed desperately at this point was a change which would eventually come when, following the 2009 draft, it was moved over to SmackDown full-time. Would this breathe some much-needed new life into the once great prize? Well, additional attempts would certainly be made here, but ultimately all of those attempts would be in vain, just as they had been over on Raw, with the reason for this being it never felt like the booking team cared about the division. Still, even if this was the case, there were plenty of acts here that would later go on to become main event stars, so there was still an element of the strap representing the future of the company, even at this low point in history. Yes, as the 2010s got going, names like Drew McIntyre, Wade Barrett, and Cody Rhodes would all have their first runs with the gold. And in Cody's case, he'd even be able to bring a smidgen of the old feeling back to Macho Man's title when he convinced WWE to return to the classic white strap design from the late 80s and early 90s. But it wasn't like everyone who held the IC belt during this period would be on a path toward the top. though some would never get there, as was the case with Ezekiel Jackson and Curtis Axel, and others would be on their way down from a prior main event run already, as happened when the Big Show became champ in April of 2012. Was there anyone who was able to build enough momentum with the gold here that they could be associated with it going forward, as people like Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, and Razor Ramon had done in the past? Yeah, to an extent. After all, when people think of the IC title today, The Miz is often one of the past champions that come to mind, with this largely being on account of the fact that after he first won it during Raw 1000 on July 23, 2012, he'd go on to win it a further 7 times down the line. Of course, that's not the record though. No, after continuing to rack up additional reigns throughout the 2010s, Chris Jericho would set the high watermark himself when he became a 9-time Intercontinental Champion, a number which still has never been beaten to this day. But even if Jericho was setting records here, it still wasn't enough to restore any real prestige to the Intercontinental title, because again, the booking of it left fans with little reason to care. And that remained the case even as a new era of stars entered the fray and got their own go-arounds with it. But no matter how many good matches they were able to have, things always returned to that status quo of the belt being little more than a prop. Hell, the infamously bad Elimination Chamber bout where Ryback won the gold for the first and only time in May of 2015 might have been a low point for the Intercontinental title overall. But even in the midst of this, there was a little glimmer of sunshine to be found, and that glimmer would occur at WrestleMania 32, as this was the event where, for one night only, Zack Ryder got his moment when he won a ladder match in order to take the belt home. Of course, once that was done though, it would be right back to the dark days again, as with the reinstitution of the brand split, the belt spent a short period being SmackDown exclusive before it was bounced back over to Raw a year later. As you would expect at this point then, this subsequent run on Raw only further devalued the once mighty prize, right? Well, not exactly. No, while it was still booked pretty poorly overall and was nowhere near the heights it had been during the 80s and 90s, there was a bit of a mini renaissance for the Intercontinental title here, as it would be held by the likes of Bobby Lashley, Finn Balor, Roman Reigns, and Seth Rollins, with Rollins in particular doing a pretty good job of adding some prestige to the gold with his bouts against opponents such as Dolph Ziggler. Yes, for the first time in a long time, it felt like the secondary strap had a little bit of momentum again. Unfortunately though, once it was moved back over to SmackDown in 2019, that momentum would quickly disappear. And the reason for this was because, despite high-level acts like Shinsuke Nakamura, Sami Zayn, and AJ Styles holding it here, it was once again a victim of bad booking and overall presentation. Would this signal the final death knell of the Intercontinental title? Well, for a while it looked like it, because the subsequent runs of Braun Strowman, Apollo Crews, and Ricochet here only further entrenched it in the fog of the mid-card. And then something happened. Something which would, after all of these years, finally turn around the fortunes of one of WWE's oldest and most celebrated pieces of hardware all over again. What would this be? Well, in June of 2022, Gunther would win the belt from Ricochet. And with this concluding with Vince McMahon being ousted from the company for the first time and Triple H taking over the book then, it meant the Austrian got a proper run with it, one which allowed him to fully dominate every opponent he went up against for almost 2 full years thereafter. That's right, by the time his reign was over, the former NXT UK champion had completely turned the fortunes of the Intercontinental title around and made it seem like something which was important again. Important enough that, when he moved on to something else, that something else was immediately the world title picture. Of course, part of the reason Gunther's reign is so highly regarded today isn't just the great matches he was having, or the fact that the belt was being booked like an actual prize worthy of holding again. No, it's also the fact that he'd be the one to finally break the Honky Tonk Man's record, with the Vienna Natives run ultimately ending at 666 days. And once he dropped it to Sami Zayn, subsequent champions would do their best to keep this reinvigorated momentum for the second piece of gold going into the mid-2020s. No, it wasn't like it was suddenly back up on the level it had been during the 80s or mid-90s when it was truly at its peak, but this was pretty damn close to that, and a hell of a lot closer than anyone thought they'd ever get to see the IC strap get to again. Yes, with recent years seeing soon-to-be main event stars like Jey Uso, future top guys in Braun Breaker and current champ Dominic Mysterio holding the gold, it felt like a true renaissance for the mid-card in WWE. But then how could it be anything other than that when we're now seeing the Intercontinental title once more be used to elevate the future, all while providing us with some of the better matches in the company, just as it had done decades ago. After all, more than anything else, that's what this belt represents. Not the glitz and glamour of the main event, but the graft that goes into getting to that level one day. And that's why it'll always be the prize of the wrestlers out there, the ones who wanted to steal the show rather than necessarily main event it. Where will it go in the future? Well, now that it's had such a great late-stage revival, the sky really is the limit. Who knows? Maybe before all is said and done, it'll once again fully reach the level of those peak years again. It's certainly not that far off from doing so, and if it does, it'll be a testament to just how valuable the belt is in the eyes of fans, as even during its darkest years, they never gave up on WWE's workhorse prize.